We'll officially say it's time to get started and welcome everyone that is joining us today for the special call meeting of the State Board of Education. Before the roll call, I do want to welcome our two newest board members, Mr. Warren Wells representing District 4 and Mr. Ryan Holtz representing the District 5, and a more formal introduction will be made of each during our quarterly board meeting on May the 20th. So welcome. We look forward to serving with you. Now, Casey Griffin will call the roll to establish a quorum.
Mr. Cobbins, Mr. Darnell.
Hang on, Casey. I see Daryl on the attendee list.
I'm here.
Mr. Darnell. Mr. Eby.
Here.
Mr. Hamby.
Here.
Mr. Holt.
Here.
Dr. House. Mr. Jensen. Mr. Mollenauer.
Here.
Mr. Morrow.
Here.
Mr. Wells.
Here.
Madam Chairman.
Here.
Madam Chairman, I count 8 members present.
Thank you. We have a quorum present and we are duly convened. Without objection, Nick Darnell is excused. Now we're going to move into item 1, the statement of necessity by Ms. Angie Sanders.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Angie Sanders, General Counsel for the Board. Pursuant to Tennessee Code Annotated Section 844-108B3, the State Board of Education makes this determination of necessity for its special call board meeting held via WebEx at 12 p.m. on April 5th, 2022. This meeting was called to consider time-sensitive rule revisions regarding universal reading screeners to ensure that those rule changes can be in place before the beginning of the 2022-23 school year. Additionally, as members of the State Board reside across the state, it was determined that a physical quorum of the members could not be assembled in Nashville for purposes of this special called board meeting. Notice of this meeting was posted on the State Board of Education's website, along with the agenda and instructions for accessing this WebEx. With that, Madam Chair, I will turn it back over to you. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. And I do want to provide a brief reminder to the board members to please state your name whenever you're making a motion or providing the second. And if you have comments or questions, please request to speak and I will acknowledge you to begin speaking. As always, this is to avoid speaking over one another. So thank you so much for adhering to that. Item 2, consent item A, adoption of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve?
Madam Chair, Bob Eby, so moved.
Mr. Eby provides the motion. Is there a second?
Jordan Mollenauer, second.
I heard 2 people at the same time. Mr. Jensen came in first, so he provides the second. Mr. Casey Griffin, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Cobbins. Mr. Cobbins. Mr. Darnell. Mr. Eby.
Aye.
Mr. Hamby.
Aye.
Mr. Holt.
Aye.
Mr. Jensen.
Aye.
Mr. Mollenauer.
Aye.
Mr. Morrow.
Aye.
Mr. Wells.
Aye.
Madam Chairman.
Aye.
Madam Chairman, I count 8 ayes.
The ayes have it and the consent agenda is approved. Thank you very much. Moving to item 3, action items on final reading. A, universal student screeners and state adopted benchmark assessments. Dr. Amy Owen and Ms. Angie Sanders will present.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Amy Owen, Deputy Executive Director for Policy and Research with the State Board. Our item that we've convened to consider today are revisions to the Universal Student Screeners and State Adopted Benchmarks Rule 0520-01-03-.15. The purpose of universal screeners are to provide a way to give short assessments to students at multiple times throughout the school year to screen for significant skill deficiencies in an area such as reading or math. And today we're specifically talking about reading. Universal reading screeners have been used in Tennessee for a number of years as part of the Response to Instruction and Intervention program, but there were a few changes from literacy-related laws passed in early 2021. One of those changes was that districts were required to use either a free reading screener provided by the department or a state board approved reading screener. They're also required to report their students' data to the state at regular intervals, and this allows us to figure out what are different needs across the state, where can the state or districts provide better support for students or technical assistance. So it gives us a better picture of what's going on throughout the school year for students in grades K through 3. As we're now in this implementation process, this is the first year under this new requirement, we wanted to establish a way to identify any screeners that are currently on the state board approved list that are not currently in compliance and may need to be removed from the list. So to get on the list, this was developed in July of 2021 based on recommendations from the Department of Education. LEAs and public charter schools were able to identify in their foundational literacy skills plans which screeners they wanted to use. And the screeners that met certain requirements were recommended for inclusion in State Board Policy 3.302, which is the State Board approved screeners. As we're moving forward and districts continue to use these tools throughout the years, we want to make sure that all of the tools remain relevant and helpful and give them the best possible information about their students. So the rule as it's designed today outlines a process for removing screeners from that list should they fail to meet requirements that are laid out in the rule. On first reading in February, we talked about this item, and the state board staff then held a public rulemaking hearing where we had several comments. We were able to incorporate some changes from those comments into the rule. We also heard from several board members on first reading that something about the process for how the department would share information with the board and then the board's executive director would come to a recommendation, that seemed kind of a confusing back and forth process, and that it was more in line with the agency's typical roles and scopes of authority for the Department of Education to continue doing monitoring and compliance with districts as they use their different screeners, and then to make a recommendation to the state board if at any point they felt that a screener needed to be removed from the list. So that is how the item is drafted here on final reading. We are having this item at a special called meeting so that the item may be fully promulgated and in effect before the next school year. That's why we're meeting today as opposed to waiting for the May 20th meeting. I am aware that the Department of Education has expressed a preference for the process as it was laid out on first reading in February, and they've had Dr. Lisa Coons join us, and she can share the department's perspective if you would like to recognize her.
Yes, please proceed, Dr. Coons. We look forward to hearing from you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to present the Department of Education's position. The Department of Education is happy to support the state board in providing technical reports about whether or not screeners and districts using those screeners have reported their information within the windows and the technical specifications that are required. However, because this is a state board approved rule, we do not have the authority to make recommendations for removal from the list. And we are happy, as the rule was written earlier, to provide regular updates and reports about districts that are in compliance and organize those by the screeners they have selected. As Amy mentioned earlier, districts can choose to use the free Tennessee Universal Reading Screener, or they can choose to use one of the other approved screeners that has been approved by the state board. Our role as the department is to ensure that districts have their data in compliance. It has been reported in a compliant methodology, and that we are able to use that data, as Amy stated, to determine how students are progressing in their performance in reading in early grades. Having state board make the recommendation based on the information and the technical information allows this process to be an objective perspective, since we are working with districts to make sure they're in compliance and understand the technical aspects of those screeners and can provide technical guidance. We do not have the authority over the vendors and their performance within their districts. Jack, was there anything else that I missed?
No, I think that was good, Dr. Coons. Thank you.
And with that, Madam Chair, that is the information on this item, and I know both State Board and department staff are happy to answer any questions you might have.
I certainly have comments and questions that I would pose, but I would much rather open it up to the other board members to go first with their questions or comments. So I'm opening up to the floor. Please let me know if you wish to be acknowledged.
Madam Chair, Bob Eby.
Mr. Eby, please proceed.
Yes, thanks. I've got a couple of questions. One, how is this any different than any other recommendation that the department makes to the state board, whether it's for EPP approvals or this process? I mean, how is this any different than the process that we've used in the past?
Chairman Eby, I'm happy to answer that from the department's perspective. I'm not quite sure if that was a question specifically for the state board staff or for the department, but from the department's perspective, this is unique in the sense that we are making a recommendation or talking about a recommendation to remove an item that has been previously approved to be put on a list. I think to your point about EPPs, the nuance or difference there would be that the department brings kind of approval statuses regarding EPPs, or if it's the initial kind of creation of an EPP, just the initial thumbs up or thumbs down. And so when we're bringing recommendations about EPPs, I would say we're not recommending them be necessarily just removed or included. It's more of an approval status. And to Dr. Coons' point, that is based on the comprehensive review process, and it's something over which, you know, we as a department do have that statutory authority, whereas with this, it is, you know, these are state board approved screeners in the statute where they're relevant, and that is also the policy is the purview of the state board where the screeners live.
Thanks, Jack. Couple of comments on that. I've attended some superintendent study council meetings where universal screeners was obviously discussed, and one of the comments that was made was that the reason, and there were some recommendations that screeners that they weren't in compliance, that they would be removed. And the reason that supposedly what I was hearing, the reason they weren't in compliance is they weren't providing the information to the department in a timely manner, even providing the information to the department. And what I was hearing from some of the superintendents was that, in fact, the issue there is that the districts, some of the districts weren't providing the information to the screeners to be able to provide the information to the departments. So it just seems to me that the way the process works is the department interfaces with the districts and interfaces with their vendors, et cetera. And that would make sense that then you would then take that data, determine whether they're in compliance, where there's not in compliance, is it the districts that aren't in compliance, is it the screeners not in compliance, and then make a recommendation to the state board. Just seems like a logical process as opposed to the state board interfacing with the districts, et cetera. And then your comment with regard to removals, I don't see any difference between a removal or a qualification. It's a recommendation. But I do think, let me ask the state board staff, are there other situations where we do get recommendations for removals from the department, or approvals or whatever?
Angie, would you like to share some of this? I think it gets into our statutory authorities and roles.
Sure. So in terms of the board receiving a recommendation from the department for inclusion of something on a list or approval, educator preparation providers, as you mentioned, Bob. We approved Category 2 non-public school accrediting agencies, alternative evaluation models, alternative salary schedules, special courses. I mean, there's a number of things that fall into this general category. As you mentioned, we also receive recommendations from the department for non-approval for educator preparation providers. That has happened in the past. And in addition, Category 2 non-public school accrediting agencies are approved on a 5-year cycle. So if a accrediting agency applies for approval and is not recommended to be on the list after those 5 years, that's essentially removing them from that list.
Thanks, Angie.
Other members, before I jump in?
This is Jordan Mollenauer.
Yes, Mr. Mollenauer.
Thank you. Dr. Coons, if you could just help me connect the dots. My understanding is of the current process, as Mr. Eby was mentioning a few minutes ago, and as updated and outlined in this particular policy, the department is okay with creating the data guide that's referenced. It's okay with the monitoring practices, which are already in place. It's okay with providing notice to the screener. And it's also okay with providing a deadline by which any remedies must be made. Am I correct so far that those are all responsibilities that the department is happy to accept?
No, sir. Our responsibility is solely towards the district. So our original responsibility was to review the screeners the districts were currently using and reported in their FLSP and determine whether or not those screeners could meet the technical requirements passed in the Literacy Success Act. Our responsibility currently in the Literacy Success Act is to set screening windows through the assessment team for districts to screen every year. We are to hold the districts in compliance. We have no coordination with the vendors other than the free vendor from the Tennessee Universal Reading Screener. We don't notify that vendor. We created the guidance for the submission of data. The district is required to hold their vendor accountable. And Mr. Eby talked about the not knowing whether the district or the vendor that provides those screeners is in compliance. We have no way of knowing that either. That is between the district and their provider that they select and that they pay for. The only thing that we know when the data comes in is if it's missing something. That could be a district issue. It could be a provider issue. There's no way for us to know where that falls within that district's ability to purchase that independent provider. The only thing that we can see in the data is if the district tested outside the window. So for example, during the winter screening, Metro Nashville Public Schools tested outside of the required window. We can see that in the data. That is the only data that we can attribute back to the district and say, you're out of compliance because you physically tested your students outside the window. Otherwise, we don't interface in between the district's contract with their provider to provide those universal reading screeners. It is our requirement to hold the district in compliance. We don't do anything with those providers unless it's the free provider that we provide the districts the opportunity to use. So we have no space in between those technical workings between the district and their purchase provider.
Okay, so just to clarify then, the department's preference in this particular case is not just that it would not be the ones to remove or make the determination to ultimately remove a provider. The department really doesn't want to assume the responsibility of the data guide, the monitoring process, the notice, or determining the deadline. Is that correct?
I apologize. We are happy to provide the guidance for submission and put that out broadly. But we can't interface with someone else's contract. So a district is contracting with that provider. They submit based on the technical guidance. If the district isn't happy with their provider, that is their responsibility. As a matter of fact, when we reviewed the providers that were interested to be approved by you as the state board, one of those providers came to one of your members and asked us to re-review. So we are happy to review providers and look at their provider and see if their provider provides the technical specification, but we can't hold that provider accountable for the services they provide the district. That's between the district and that provider and their contract. The only contracted provider we have is the free one that Amy mentioned that is free for districts to use and purchase. We have a contract directly with them. We can hold that that universal reading screener provider accountable. We don't have any contracting or statutory authority to hold other providers accountable. And under the statute, the Literacy Success Act, it is the state's approved or the state board's approved list for districts to choose from.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I'm going to cede the time to our chairman.
Thank you. So a couple of points of clarification. So it's a state board rule whereby the department comes to us with an approval, a list of vendors that they are recommending for approval. We have no way of knowing anything about those vendors except what comes from the department. So you present the recommendation for the board. The board then goes through a process in a board meeting whereby we ask questions if we have questions about those particular vendors. And similarly, we would have the authority as the state board in this particular rule, because it is a state board rule, to ask the department or to request of the department to provide us a recommendation based on your experience with the LEA and knowledge of what is not coming through accurately from a vendor. If so, in my mind's eye, the department has the information to provide us with a valid, fair, complete recommendation, and the board would still have the responsibility, regardless of who's making the recommendation, to in fact ask all the right questions, do our appropriate due diligence, and ensure that we're satisfied that we have enough information to make an informed decision to accept a recommendation to remove. And likewise, as always, our staff, our state board staff, would take any information that you're providing in the way of a recommendation to the board, and in fact, go through a process of saying, yes, we believe this is very thorough. We have all the information we believe our board members need, and therefore we would back your recommendation and have you present it at a state board meeting, because you all know all the details, the nuances, all the particulars. And our people, we're not involved with the vendors either. We're not involved with the LEA. We're not having those engagement opportunities. So it still appears to me, and I don't know that there's anything, and I'm looking at our general counsel, Angie Sanders, that would prevent our rule from asking the department to make the recommendation and let us do our part, which is go through that rigorous process and due diligence to ask all the appropriate questions to say, we accept that recommendation, or we don't, we need more information, or we want to allow the vendor an opportunity, or LEA, or both, to come before us and state their case. Is there anything that would prevent us from, and I think not, because we have it written in the rule that's before us today, that we change the recommendation from the executive director of the state board to the Department of Education. So, Ms. Sanders, would you?
Yes, Madam Chair. Angie Sanders, again, General Counsel for the board. We have authority through our rules to set up the process the way that the board sees fit, and the board has already through its rules said that the Department of Education will bring a recommendation to the board regarding screeners that should be included on the list after their review of the screeners that were presented to them. And so we also therefore follows that we have the authority to say that the department would also bring a recommendation in the event that a district is out of compliance due to a use of a screener that is unable to comply with the rule.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from board members?
This is Jordan Mullenhour.
Yes, Mr. Mullenhour.
Thank you for that clarification, Ms. Sanders. I guess the point that I was trying to get to earlier was just the nature of the decision and interactions that are occurring. And it seems to me that the department is in a better position to establish the data guide, as we've already discussed, to monitor at some level, just because the department's already engaged with the LEAs and with the LEAs on a more frequent basis, to then provide notice, to make the determination of the deadline, all the things that we've that have been built into the current proposal, and then ultimately to make the recommendation. In other words, those dots seem to connect well in that it's a logical sequence of information and interactions by a party that would be the most likely to be informed to, for example, determine what a deadline should be, all factors considered. I guess I'm just trying to understand why the department would want to break that chain of sequenced steps as has been proposed. And Dr. Coons, can you just clarify one more time why the department would not want to see each of those dots connect up to the point of a recommendation being made?
Certainly happy to. We don't, I think that was mentioned that we have information on vendor performance. We actually don't have information on vendor performance. We have information on whether or not a district submits compliantly within the window and submits records accurately. Again, I will reiterate, we don't know if that's a vendor issue or a district issue. That's between the district and the vendor. So I'm happy to provide technical reports about who is in compliance and organize those compliance reports by why they might have not been out of compliance and by the providers that they choose. But I don't have any way of knowing whether that's a vendor issue that district is managing or a district issue in between that data. So I don't have the capacity or ability to give you a vendor recommendation on where the problem lies.
Okay, I'll cede the floor for other questions. Thank you.
This is Nate Morrow, Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Morrow, please proceed.
So Dr. Kuhn, so if I'm understanding this correctly, you are saying that when you do give the reports, you're only going to be able to give technical reports. Is that correct?
Yep, I'm happy to give whether or not a district is in compliance, out of compliance, whether or not their data was formatted correctly. I don't know if that data formatting correctly comes from the district issues or from the vendor issues. All I know is whether or not that district is in compliance and what vendor they're using and what might be the technical problem in their data on whether or not it's usable by our IT team. I can't tell you where the breakdown was in the process, as was stated earlier, that we have knowledge between whether the district is having a problem or the vendor is having a problem. We have no way of knowing that. I can provide you with a technical report on where the breakdown is, but I cannot tell you if that is a universal reading screener data issue at the district level, if it is a performance level by the vendor they have selected. I can only tell you whether or not that district is in compliance and what the problem is with their data. I can't tell you where in the breakdown between the contract with the district or their provider, or whether it was a breakdown in the data entry at the district side. I can't tell you where that problem was, and I don't have the authority to do so because I can't reach out to a district's contracted vendor to determine what that solution is. I can provide all the districts and all the vendors who are being used in the state with a technical guide on how to submit that and how data should be submitted, but I cannot tell you between the district and that provider where the breakdown might be to say this vendor is not performing appropriately. The only person, honestly, who would be able to tell you that is the district having an issue with their contracted provider.
And so the universal screener is to help us identify student learning progressions, like how the kids are doing, correct?
Universal reading screener, as outlined in the Literacy Success Act, helps us understand whether or not kids have phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary development, and comprehension.
Perfect. So it seems to me problematic that so the department doesn't get any performance on how the students are learning to read? You just get the technical report?
We absolutely get that from the data that is provided if it's clean and available for us to use. What I think we are talking and speaking about is those districts who submit data that can't be translated in the system across all of those providers for us to understand how students in each district are performing in comparison to their peers and in comparison to national norms. So if a district submits data out of compliance, we can't actually use that data to understand what's happening with those students, but we don't know where the data breakdown is between a district and a chosen contracted vendor on the state approved list, unless it is the free vendor that was selected and contracted by us.
So say it's not the free vendor and you get that report and it's not correct and you're not sure why, would you not then call the district and say, hey, this is out of compliance, why? And then then it would be the district or the LEA's responsibility to go figure that out, right that wrong, and get back to you?
That's absolutely correct, and that is what we did during the winter benchmarking window. We notified districts that were out of compliance. We sent them their exception reports, which tells why their data is not compliant, and then it is the district's responsibility to work with their contracted provider to correct that and get that data back into us correctly.
Okay, and so they were then able to get, but so my point in that is, if that's happening and has been happening, and while you may not get the full, you only get the out of compliance on the front end, we then find out after further review how students are learning to read. And my thought on that is, by that logic, then you would be able to, like if it's the same district or the same vendor and there's 2 or 3 times there's been something up, well, now we have a flag of concern where we may alter a recommendation based on the data that we've gathered by them being both out of compliance and being so on a frequent basis or every time we check. Am I missing something in here?
Madam Chair, may I offer what may be a helpful clarification?
Yes, please go ahead.
Great, thank you. In a drafting version of this that we had shared with the department for feedback, it did ask the department to attribute whether the error came from the district or the vendor. Based on the points that Dr. Coons just made, we had removed that language about having attribution of where the errors were coming from. What is asked for now is that the department submit data comparing the performance of the Universal Reading Screener as compared to other state board approved Universal Reading Screeners, including but not limited to the number of accurate and inaccurate data sets submitted by each approved vendor out of the total required data sets within the required window, whether all of the data sets were submitted for each LEA or public charter school by each approved vendor, because our understanding is that it is the screening vendors that submit the data rather than the LEA, so please correct me if I misunderstood that, and the number of errors in the data sets. So that's the information that would be essentially the backup to any recommendation. I don't know if that's helpful, but I'm happy to help as I can with further questions.
And that was
That's
on
great for me, thank you.
Yeah, and that's on page 5, excuse me, 5 of the red line version in the middle of the page. Just for clarification, item is I, small letter I.
That's correct, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, Bobby,
Yes, Mr. Eby.
if I understood Dr. Coons correctly, the process, the way it works is that the department or the districts are working with the vendors to determine if they're, to get the data, determine if they're in compliance or out of compliance, or they provide, and then they provide that to the department, who then, I guess, determines in or out of compliance. If the state board were to take that function over, the state board would be interfacing directly with the districts, who then go to the vendors. And it just doesn't seem to me overall, going back to Mr. Mullenhour's comment about consistency, appears to me that the consistency matter is that the districts interface primarily with the department, who then interfaces with the state board, just about every accident we have. So, from a consistency standpoint, it makes even more sense that that the recommendation provided by the staff is the appropriate approach for this. That's my thoughts.
When you say staff, do you mean the department?
Yes. I mean, well, what I'm saying is that the recommendation made by the state board staff of the rule that we're, the write-up of the new rule, the state board staff recommended approval of that. And so what I'm saying is that makes more sense to me than going back to the way that the rule was written 3 months ago, because the consistency of the interface, the districts would interface with their vendors, who then the districts would then interface with the department staff, who then would interface by making a recommendation to the state board. Did that make sense?
Well, I was a little bit confused by that and maybe it's only me, Bob, so I want to make sure, because the way that the rule is written today, the rule that you have before you speaks to the department making the recommendation
Correct.
to the board to remove a vendor or vendors based on non-compliance. And we usually get a summary sheet, as we did today for this one, where the state board staff goes along with the recommendation for this, in this particular case, and they would likewise do the same thing when an item would come before us from the department recommending the removal. Our team of staff members would go through a process and then say, we do recommend the board approve, but I'm not sure that I understood that you were
Yeah, no,
stating.
what I'm saying is the recommendation that the state board staff made today for approval of this rule,
Okay,
which gives that responsibility to the district, I mean, to the department to interface with the districts to bring a recommendation to us, I think is consistent with basically how the entire department, state board responsibilities, overall responsibilities and interactions are. And to change that, I think would, I mean, basically what it would do if we didn't pass the rule as it is right now, then the state board would be interfacing directly with the districts, if I heard Dr. Coons correctly. And I don't think in general, that's the way that we operate or should be operating. Does that make sense?
it's clear. I understand. Thank you. Other questions or comments?
Madam Chair, this is Darrell Cobbins.
Yes, Mr. Cobbins.
So I concur with Mr. Eby, and from my reading, once the department determines that a vendor or district is non-compliant, that there's a period of time that the department provides for that district to become compliant, after which there is supposed to be some action of some kind, which isn't, to me, 100% clear. And so it seems that at that point is where the determination should be, as I think it's written, that the department would then make a recommendation to the state board that here are the non-compliant districts and the associated vendors, and then the state board would have an action that they would have to take. So I just want to make sure that my understanding of what's written is clear, especially at that point at which the department would deem non-compliance after that period has been given to correct that non-compliance. I hope that question makes sense.
Amy or Angie, do you want to clarify and respond to Mr. Cobbins?
I'm happy to do that, Madam Chair. This is Angie Sanders again. Daryl, you're correct. So the way the rule is written, when an LEA is out of compliance, the department would notify them and let them know that you are out of compliance, outline the reasons for non-compliance, and give a deadline by which they would need to work with their universal reading screener vendor to come into compliance. The rule also states that if they fail to come into compliance by the specified deadline, that the department may recommend to the board that the screener be removed if the non-compliance is as a result of the use of a screener that is not complying with the requirements in the rule. So the department has some flexibility there, and that may was on purpose for them to recognize that there may be situations that don't necessarily rise to the level of a recommendation for removal. In the event that they do make that recommendation, as you stated, the rule requires a comparative information that Amy mentioned earlier around data that lets the board know, here is how this data or this screener and these districts, how many errors they've had, the issues that we're seeing compared to other districts and the screeners that they're using. And so the board would also be able to ask for any additional information that they would like to have in making that determination. So there's a lot of additional things built into this rule besides just the recommendation of the department to allow the board to collect any additional information they feel like they need. It's also clear in here that both the vendor and any district or public charter school can request to speak at the meeting to state their piece as to whether or not they feel like it's merited that this vendor come off the list.
Okay, thank you. And with that understanding, from a consistency standpoint, it appears that the proper and prudent thing to do is to maintain that consistent communication between the districts and the department, so that ultimately, based on whatever outcome occurs, you know, at the end of all of that you discussed, that whatever action that the department deems is necessary comes to the state board from a consistent line of communication, as opposed to a line of communication and then a handoff and then communication coming to us. So that's just my opinion, and appreciate everyone's work on this and the thought and diligence that's gone into trying to make it palatable. But that's my perspective on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cobbins. Any other questions or comments?
Madam Chairman, Jordan Mullenhour.
Yes, Ms. Mullenhour.
I'd like to just synthesize previous comments from Mr. Eby and Mr. Cobbins and just give one example. If we have a vendor, for example, that for whatever reason is out of compliance, and then that vendor is under the department's preference, if that vendor is then essentially interacting with the board, as Mr. Cobbins explained a second ago, and then they come back into compliance again, then they're handed back over to the department for further monitoring. That's the handoff that Mr. Cobbins was talking about. If you think about the stakeholders that we have, both the districts as well as the vendors themselves, if I was a vendor, I would not want to be in communication with party A and then get shifted to party B and then get shifted back to party A again. It just creates a lot of confusion. It seems like an inefficient way to manage that relationship. I understand that the department has a lot of other responsibilities, and that there are many other there's a great deal of other important work to be done. But if you look at this from the standpoint of the stakeholders outside of the people on this that are talking today, the department and the board, it just seems like to service them better, it would make sense to, again, I'll use the term connect the dots and keep that maintain continuity. You've heard that phrase come up today. And I'm just trying to understand why that would not be the preference of everyone on this call. And again, I'll cede the floor. I know that our chairman has some thoughts on this and would love to hear hers as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mullenhour. And I've stated this before, that I continue to believe that based on the interaction that the department has with the LEA, regardless of they're not having the direct contact with the vendor, we're not having the contact with the vendor either. And I consistently believe that it is a smoother, more logical, consistent way and approach to having the department make the recommendation to us, because of the fact that they have all of the evidence, they have all of the data, they have all of the information. And we're not really technically doing a handoff in the traditional sense of it. What we're talking about is having the department make a recommendation based on their interaction with the LEA, where there is consistently some issues and challenges with their particular vendor. And there could be multiple districts that are using the same vendor and having challenges with that particular vendor. And that's even further evidence that there's a problem perhaps with the vendor and not necessarily the LEA. But it's in a way, to me, a moot point as to whether it's the LEA or the vendor, because it is the responsibility of the LEA to get their vendor to come into compliance. It's not the department's and it's not ours. So I still stand firmly in my opinion that the recommendation comes to us from the department, and that we do our due diligence in the line of questioning that we would typically ask. And if necessary, an LEA and a vendor would come before us collectively or separately and state their case. And I may have missed something else that you said, Mr. Mullenhour, because someone had sent a message to me via text that was pertinent to this conversation. So did I miss the point?
I think you stated the points beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you. I do also want to make note of the fact that all of our rules go before the General Assembly, and anything that we put into a rule has to be reviewed by the Attorney General, and therefore they would agree or tell us and let us know that there is an issue or a challenge or concern with the recommendation that has been put into the rule. Have I misstated anything, team? Angie Sanders, Amy Owen?
No, that's correct, Madam Chair. All of our rules are reviewed by the Attorney General for not only authority, but legality before they sign off on that, and those are submitted to the Secretary of State's office.
Very good. Thank you for that. Any other questions or comments?
Make one more comment, Madam Chair.
Yes, please, go ahead.
There were some comments and some letters that were submitted on this from some vendors, and I would say just I'd like to publicly thank them for that input. I would also like to mention that I felt that there were some recommendations that were made that were not in the best interest of the students of Tennessee, and would just like to say as a blanket statement that the board and the department, I think I'm speaking on behalf of the department more broadly, considers all comments and input. But our first commitment is to the students of Tennessee, and to the extent that we see inconsistencies in the proposals or the opinions that are being offered by outside vendors, it's taken into account, and we'd just like to encourage all vendors to put forth also our students' best interests as they're making recommendations, because I felt that there were some that were inconsistent with that objective. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. I'm so glad you said that on the record. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Madam Chair, this is Bob Eby. I agree with Mr. Mullenhour, but also there were some very good comments in those hearings. I listened to them too, and I think they did get worked in here, and I appreciate those comments.
I did too, and I did appreciate those who took the time to provide information in writing, their feedback in writing as well. So thank you for that. Last call for questions or comments. Hearing none, is there a motion to approve item 3A?
Madam Chair, this is Bob Eby. I move that we approve as recommended by the State Board staff.
Mr. Eby provides the motion. Is there a second?
Madam Chair, this is Jordan Mullenhour.
Second.
So Mr. Mullenhour provides the second. Is there any further discussion? Casey, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Cobbins,
Aye.
Mr. Darnell, Mr. Eby,
Aye.
Mr. Hamby,
Aye.
Mr. Holt,
Aye.
Mr. Jensen,
Aye.
Mr. Mullenhour,
Aye.
Mr. Morrow,
Aye.
Mr. Wells.
Aye.
Madam Chairman,
Aye.
9 ayes, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. The ayes have it, and the motion is approved. Before we adjourn, I do want to thank Dr. Owen, Ms. Sanders, and Dr. Kuntz and actually Jack Powers. You have been very diligent in all of your efforts and work with this particular rule, and I know it's been a challenging time, but I think we have come to the proper conclusion in the way that this has turned out today. But I do want to thank you so much for your hard work in this particular regard. If there are no comments from anyone else, I certainly open it up if anyone wants to add any closing comments.
Madam Chair, this is Bob Eby.
Yes, Mr. Eby.
I have a comment totally, probably out of agenda, but I want to give a shout out to the department. I happen to be on public education television today and saw the Tennessee Education Block, and I think Virginia Mayfield was doing a session on math, teaching, counting, and adding. And I thought she did an outstanding job. So just encourage people, this is a great resource that we have. It was done virtually, and she did very good. So I just want to give a shout out for that.
Thank you, Mr. Eby. Any other comments? Hearing none and without objection, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Madam Chair, thank you, board members.
Thank you.